Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I know we have people from all over the world joining us, so we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and chat with our panelists. Just a quick note before I hand it off to Leslie. If you need to ask a question at any point, just use the questions tab on your webinar dashboard. That'll be the primary way to interact with both myself and the panelists themselves. Otherwise, if you have any technical problems, feel free to start a direct chat or use the questions tab with me. So without further ado, Leslie, take us away.
Great, Mike. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome everyone to AACRO's webinar, Reconvening after AACRO's Fall Symposium, Global Recognition in International Admissions and Credential Evaluation. In today's webinar, AACRO staff come together with members to continue the discussion that we began earlier this year at our Fall Symposium. Today, we'll recap the important points of the discussion we had at the symposium and hear some analysis and takeaways from several of our colleagues who attended. Today's webinar will be recorded for later viewing. We'll also be sending a follow-up email to you requesting your feedback about this presentation. Moderating today's panel is Julia Funaki, my colleague at AACRO. Our panelists include Chris Adams of Indiana University, Suli Saucedo of Texas Women's University, and Becca Tavartkiladze of World Education Services Toronto office. You can read all of our speakers' bios at the end of this presentation. Briefly, the way today's webinar structure will be laid out is Julia will give background on the Global Convention and a summary of AACRO's Fall Symposium. And then we'll turn it over to our panelists who will discuss topics related to the Global Convention from their own perspectives, both personal and professional. We'll then investigate our international student recruitment strategies in the United States, our position in the world, and what we can do to continue the discussion of how global recognition can impact international student recruitment, admissions, and international credential evaluation. Julia, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Leslie. I am going to start with some brief background on how and why we came to Symposium and the Global Convention. UNESCO stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which grew from a meeting of a conference of Allied Ministers of Education back before the Second World War ended. By the end of the Second World War, they decided to convene and pretty quickly came to the idea of this global organization, UNESCO. So since its beginning in 1945, UNESCO has served as a global forum to discuss issues related to education, and particularly the recognition of higher education qualifications and the promotion of academic mobility. So this is not something new. It really has prepared and adopted recommendations and international guidelines and regional level guidelines in the field of higher education. UNESCO's Convention on the Recognition of Global Higher Education Qualifications really began with regional conventions that were the first generation and the second generations. We've given you the dates on the screen here on the slide. Let me make sure we're on the right slide for you all. Go back one slide, Mike. Well, the regional conventions began starting in 1974, and you just see that they're divided up by regions. So in 1974, Latin America, and we went on through to a whole second generation of conventions. And I think that's an important background because you'll see even with the regional conventions, there was this idea of mobility within regions. And since then, higher education has become far more global in the number of institutions, programs, access, and in global academic mobility. Really what has been called the massification of education. For additional background, we have a lot of resources located at the end of this presentation. One of the objectives, and a very important one, is really to facilitate global mobility, which we already mentioned, but also merit in higher education for the mutual benefit of qualification holders, higher education institutions, employers, and other relevant stakeholders. So this really is something, too, that they built into it, the respecting the diversity of the parties of higher education systems involved. This also comes in, this tenet here really, in fact, impacts that value of diversity and the concept of substantial differences, the recognition of partial studies, and recognition for general appointment. These all come together with a lot of the work we've done also with refugees and displaced persons, which, as you know, is an important issue for AACRO, and we can see in the work that we've done on our displaced and vulnerable students publication, as well as the Article 26 backpack. Next slide. One of the other major objectives of the convention is to provide an inclusive global framework for the fair, transparent, consistent, coherent, timely, and reliable recognition of qualifications concerning education. This is just basic to the convention itself, and something that I think a lot of us can recognize is an important objective for all of us in the work that we do. So, what is the Global Convention? We'll give you a hint. It's not an admissions decision. And this is important. I think there's some idea that somehow with this Global Convention, we're being given a mandate and rules that are suggested that we need to follow. Rather, the Global Convention is an instrument for the development and implementation of agreed recognition principles and procedures. It will not be an instrument for automatic recognition. A global convention fully recognizes the sovereign nature of higher education policies and thus the sovereignty of state parties to award diplomas, degrees, and certificates in all fields of higher education within their system. Therefore, and this is important, the convention will not weaken in any way the autonomy of academic institutions. All right. At this point, I want to bring in our panelists from the institutions, Chris Adams and Suli Saucedo. Chris and Suli, I'd like to know just a little bit, and our audience to know just a little bit, what was your background knowledge of the agreements leading up to the Global Convention?
Thanks, Julia. Yeah. So yeah, as you stated, coming into the symposium, I knew very little about what the Global Convention specifically covered. You mentioned that's not an admissions decision. And I think initially that was my perspective, that it was kind of laying out guidelines on how to admit students. But as the discussions developed during the symposium, I realized that it was more about establishing guidelines on how rather than specifically what to review. So giving students a fair review of their documents, but not necessarily saying you should accept this document over this one, etc. Signatories to the convention are bound to adhere to the tenets within, and even though the U.S. is unlikely to join, I think there are steps we're able to take in upholding those tenets, but as institutions in the U.S. are autonomous, we can determine our own standards, but use the Global Convention as kind of a guidebook or guidelines when determining that, when informing our best practice. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Suli to give her perspective from her institution.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. As for me, prior to attending the Fall Symposium, I had very little knowledge of what the Global Convention was about and its objectives. I was just interested to learn if like a global agreement on the recognition of qualification was something that was even attainable. And whenever you think of something globally, you know, that does, you know, call for a lot of factors and things to be involved. So I wanted to see how it would impact the U.S. and what would be our limitations, since it was mentioned that we cannot be a signatory. So I didn't have much prior knowledge, but personally what really helped during the symposium was hearing about the Lisbon Recognition Convention at the symposium, which provided great insight on the history of the efforts towards this global recognition that, you know, are already in place, and how they're how other institutions and organizations are involved in that. So it was like Julia mentioned, I wasn't sure if admissions and being dictated how to recognize certain qualifications played a part in that, but it does not. It's not admission, it's more so of a right for a fair assessment of the qualifications. Julia?
Julia, you might be muted.
Sorry, thank you, Mike. Yeah, thank you, Suli. That's exactly so. I think there are a lot of institutions out there that think that they are required to follow this convention if the U.S. were to be along in it, but it absolutely recognizes the autonomy. Let's go on to the next question. So, in thinking about this, what does the Global Convention mean to you? Is there something in the convention that resonates with you, with your institution, with the work that you do on a day-to-day basis? Chris?
Yeah, so like I said, as the discussions were going on at the symposium, I think it became pretty apparent early that a lot of my colleagues in other institutions were already upholding the guidelines set forth by the Global Convention. I know at Indiana University, we already follow most of those points. We provide a fair and equal review of applications to IU regardless of system, country, background of where these applicants are coming from. Even though these practices are maintained in day-to-day review of our applications, we've also identified the importance of transparency in making sure students are informed of the practices that we're using to review their applications. Part of that, it's kind of embracing the spirit of the Global Convention of providing these fair, equitable reviews for any students regardless of background. Something that we've gone along with that's also outlined in the convention is the idea of transparency. So our website details our entire admissions process, what's expected of students as they navigate through it, what they need to turn in. So this covers everything from how they submit their application, what academic records are required, through to what financial documents they have to provide so we can issue them an immigration document. But also best ways to prepare for a shift from their current experience or setting to a U.S. university. With this transparency, we're also providing a welcoming environment and showing that so that we're demonstrating our commitment to their success when they do arrive and helping to inform them as they're making an important life decision to come to the U.S. to study at our campus. By having that information available, the students are the ones making their decisions. They're understanding what's required of them. It's less of stating explicitly, we will review your application the same as everybody else's, but going a bit deeper and giving them more information to show them exactly what we're requiring. So they're able to make those decisions on their own and they feel empowered. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Suli to talk about her institution.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. For as far as what the Global Convention means to us, I think it's a shared interest in supporting academic mobility and the promotion of higher education. So I think that is key to these efforts. And the U.S. may not be able to be signatory, as we mentioned, but we can take it as a model from which we can improve our global mobility efforts in order to remain competitive. And I think that is both locally, just as institutions, and for the U.S. as a whole. And honestly, my first impression of the Global Convention was that it appeared, as you mentioned, to lay out principles that we in some form already follow. But I think that it calls also for some form of action so that we do not remain stagnant, so that we do not remain just the same as others are collaboratively making efforts towards this global mobility cause. And there were certain objectives and principles that really stood out to me during the symposium, and that I think we could bring back here and really work on as far as institutional wise.
So, two of the basic principles for the recognition of qualifications concerning higher education that are specifically outlined are that individuals have the right to have their qualifications assessed, and that recognition decisions are based on appropriate, reliable, accessible, and up-to-date information. With that, Suli, could you talk a little bit about those principles and objectives and a little bit more about what they mean to you and your institution?
Sure, and those are two principles that really resonated with me. Now, it's important to note that the Global Convention is not only about providing a fair and transparent assessment, but that it's a right. Individuals have the right to have their qualifications assessed for the purpose of applying for admissions to study or seek employment opportunities. So, and equally important to that is that it should be achieved based on up-to-date information. Recognition decisions are based on appropriate, reliable, accessible, and up-to-date information on higher education systems, institutions, programs, and quality assurance mechanisms provided to the competitive authorities of the parties, official national information centers, or similar entities. Now, there's a very important point that was brought up during the symposium, and that was that training is often left as an insignificant part of one's position or job, or perhaps it simply isn't an option. So there are barriers at times that prohibit evaluators from staying up to date on educational system changes. And as we know, the only thing constant is change in this field. So it's really important to maintain the most current information. So from the perspective of working at a state institution, one of the most common barriers is probably budget, and I'm certain that that's probably the case for many others. But in hearing this particular discussion, I believe it also, to me, it brought up that there may be a lack of awareness by administrations or the powers that be of the importance of receiving proper training. I think this principle challenges us to be advocates and find ways to educate others of the importance of the needs to stay informed of the changes. Otherwise, how are we going to move forward, and how will it be possible to deliver a transparent and fair assessment called for in these principles? So those are just two things that really resonated with me as an attendee of the symposium, and how it would relate to our institution.
Thank you, Suli. You know, there are a couple other objectives in the convention that I just want to highlight and pull out for you all. And first is the respecting and upholding and protecting the autonomy and the diversity of higher education institutions and their systems. And I think this is something we feel profoundly important to what our work that we do here in the United States, but also to promote that culture of quality assurance in higher education institutions and systems. So, Suli, once again, I'm going to come back to you. Could you just talk a little bit about these objectives and what they mean to you? Maybe Chris as well.
Okay, absolutely, Julia. Sure. Yeah, these two objectives also stood out to me, the respect, uphold, and protect the autonomy and the diversity of higher institutions, higher education institutions and the systems. There's no regulatory body in the US, as we all know, that oversees the assessment of qualification. So equivalencies and requirements, they're going to differ among institutions. So it was good to know that the Global Convention acknowledges and respects institutions' autonomy. When learning about the Global Convention, that was, as I mentioned, one of the concerns. I was thinking that, okay, are we going towards having just one standard equivalency, you know? And I don't know if that would be possible, but luckily that's not the idea of the Global Convention at all. The second objective was that of quality assurance, and that is to promote a culture of quality assurance in higher education institutions and systems. As y'all can see on the slide, I won't read through it all, but again, I think that this is something that we strive for in our individual organizations. Quality assurance, to me, I can see that it is evident in the continuous training that is available and this research that takes place by various U.S. organizations in this field. Despite the variations and the autonomy, I think we strive for a delivery of a fair and transparent assessment and to some degree consensus and recognition. What are your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, so both to the points of the autonomy of institutions in the U.S., but also for quality assurance. I mean, it's obvious that we don't have a central regulatory body. Each institution is kind of set up to operate in a vacuum in a way. So I know at IU we talk to our peers in the field, so peer institutions. I talk to colleagues from similar universities in their own admissions offices or international units within those admissions offices. So even though there are many resources out there that are offered by different organizations, it's always important to talk to your peers. They may have a specialist in their office that you don't possess. They're able to better inform best practice on your campus. So both the ideas of an institution being autonomous and setting its own practices and policies, but using information that's out there that people are more than happy to give, in my experience, to inform that best practice on your campus, if not only to maintain some consistency among schools in the U.S., but again, also for the student to understand and not be blindsided by wholly different policies from one institution to the next, and really understand what they need to provide to be admitted and to be successful. And I'll go ahead and pass it back over to Sully.
And one other, just as far as the institutions and the number of higher institutions and boards that exist, both public and private, offer alternatives due to the autonomy, and hopefully will continue to make Texas and the U.S. a top destination. According to the 2018 IIE Open Doors report, Texas is ranked 3rd in the U.S. for international students, and my hope is that its institutions continue to maintain that level of commitment and adhere to the methodology that promotes academic mobility. It will allow us to move forward even during these challenging times. Julia?
So now we're going to hear from Becca, who represents World Education Services from their Canada office. Becca understands the issues from both the U.S. and the Canadian perspective, which makes his comments especially interesting and valuable. Becca?
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much.
Here. Can you give us a brief background, Becca, of WES and the variety of ways in which WES interacts with its clients, just so the audience has a better idea of that?
Thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be part of this webinar. Thank you very much for inviting me. Definitely, WES is a multi-purpose organization, and it adheres to standards laid out in Global Recognition Convention. Led by its mission, which is on the screen, World Education Services has been dedicated to helping immigrants and refugees with international education education achieved success in the US for 45 years, and we have been in Canada for almost 20 years now. In that time frame, some 300 million immigrants and refugees have received our assessments, WES's assessments. WES has always been adhering and advocating for standards laid out in proposed Global Recognition Convention, which is to create consistency, fairness, and transparency in the way international educational credentials are assessed. May I advance this slide, Julia? Thank you. Well, here, this is a quick timeline of 45 years. WES was founded in New York City in 1974, and it's one of the first independent U.S. organizations specializing in credential assessment for internationally educated professionals. Now, we have come a long way since then, and I would focus on the recent progress. Sorry, I jumped too quickly. I would highlight last 4 years for WES's work, and I think you would agree with me that the developments in the world with respect to global mobility of students, immigrants, and refugees has been at the pivotal moment. Over the years, we at WES have sought to advance the global mobility and integration of people into academic and professional settings by evaluating and advocating for the recognition of international educational qualifications. We do it so that individuals can put their education to use. This year, we expect to serve up to 450,000 people around the world who aspire to come to the US or Canada. Like many of us in the field, we know that the recognition of qualifications is a critical step in building lives and in rebuilding the lives of refugees' identities in a new country. We also know that both individual and community benefit when people are able to put the full breadth of their education and training and work experience. Julia?
Thank you, Becca. Did you want to say anything more, Becca, about really how you see the GRC, the Global Convention, impacting the work that a foreign credential evaluation agency such as WES does? And please talk about your work with U.S. institutions versus your work with Canadian institutions vis-a-vis the Global Convention.
Thank you. Thanks, Julia. Well, WES participates and lends its expertise to international efforts to advance a humane and ethical approach to global mobility. We at WES also, through our efforts, raise the awareness of and the importance of academic credential assessment. And we are contributing to the capacity and consistency of academic credential assessments in Canada and the US. We are doing this through training and information sharing to the broader community of academic credential assessors in professional regulatory bodies and post-secondary educational institutions. Now, because WES operates both in Canada and the US, we are also able to bring a cross-border perspective and expertise to the conventions, which calls for the recognition of academic qualifications across Europe and Canada. We empower the individual. That's what we believe. WES helps internationally educated individuals, including students, immigrants, and refugees, by providing them with credential evaluation reports which demonstrate their educational qualifications in US or Canadian context. Now, I would like to take you back a little bit, almost 4 years ago, and speak a little bit about the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which is truly a precursor to the Global Recognition Convention, and how it provided a framework for WES to start assisting applicants who could not substantiate their qualifications with documentation. And perhaps we can unpack some different realities vis-a-vis Canada and the US, and how Global Recognition Convention is going to influence our interactions with various partners. Well, we found ourselves in a situation spurred by the Syrian refugee crisis. And WES began developing a methodology to provide refugees and displaced people lacking full official or verifiable documentation with credible evaluation reports. Now, we began with a pilot study in Canada. The pilot ran through 2017 and provided 337 Syrian refugees in Canada with evaluation reports. Now, our follow-up research shows that these reports have been used and widely recognized in Canada. Participants have used the reports to continue their education, professional licensure, and some of them have a meaningful employment because of that. One young man came to us when he couldn't get proof of his bachelor's degree from the University of Aleppo. And West's report helped him earn a slot in a prestigious 4-year music program. Another young woman contacted us after losing her law career when she fled Syria. She used her credential evaluation for entry to one of Canada's most competitive law schools, York University's Osgoode Hall, and is well on her way to rebuilding the career that meant so much to her. Now, in 2018, we expanded the pilot and established a permanent credential evaluation program in Canada called the West Gateway Program. And we had a number of countries, individuals from countries such as Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Ukraine, Venezuela is the last. They are all eligible if they come from these countries. Now, the West Gateway program provides credential evaluations for displaced people who lack official documentation, but have at least one piece of credible proof of academic attainment. The program launched in Canada in October of 2018 and is being piloted in the United States now. This was possible in Canada because assessing credentials for refugees and others with limited documentation is required under international agreements. Canada has recently ratified the Lisbon Recognition Convention of 1997, which most of us know is an international agreement among mostly Western countries that requires that foreign educated and trained individuals receive fair credential assessments. Now, this includes those with limited documentation, and particularly refugees and the displaced. Now, due to its ratification, Lisbon Recognition Convention in Canada provides the legal framework for assessing the credentials. Now, ratification certainly enables the systemic change and helps to advocate for transparent and fair practices. Again, Global Recognition Convention will provide more teeth, I believe, and will strengthen the rights of international students, skilled immigrants, and foreign trained professionals. Besides providing the rights to individuals, the convention will also assist in internationalization, which in turn will contribute to educational quality, educational diversity, and educational resources across the borders. Higher education institutions are redefining their missions and values in more global terms. This will certainly affect and have systemic change. Lisbon Recognition Convention has played a catalyst role for systemic change in continental Europe, and we've seen that in Canada as well, specifically for the refugee community. And also, it provided examples for other regions to develop fair, reliable, and non-discriminatory procedures vis-à-vis the recognition of educational qualifications. Global Recognition Convention is building on the gains of Lisbon Recognition Convention and will promote more international cooperation in higher education and research. It will also enhance the quality of education and provide greater opportunities for cultural intelligence, dialogue, and peace building, and will support the sustainable development of these knowledge societies. Also, it's extremely important to mention that Global Recognition Convention is not going to mandate automatic recognition. And I think previous presenters spoke about this issue. It provides autonomy to states, institutions, and organizations. It is a framework which emphasizes the importance of fair recognition processes, which is shifting the burden of proof from the student to the body responsible for recognition and takes into account the diversity of educational providers and the new models of learning, which is very promising, if you ask me. Julia?
So the Global Recognition Convention, the Global Convention as we refer to it, is really a multi-dimensional tool. So we'll start with you, Becca. Can you just explain what that means as it pertains to international qualifications? What's a multi-dimensional tool?
Well, thank you, Julia. Well, reviewing the various parts of the Global Recognition Convention, I would like to highlight certain, I would call, improvements vis-a-vis other similar conventions. Also, it has a potential to be a tool to advance the recognition of international qualifications for foreign trained professionals across the globe, not only in certain regions. Now, the Global Recognition Convention is similar and also different when it comes to other similar regional conventions. It talks about learning outcomes, where a learner acquired knowledge and skill upon completion of a learning process. We also notice that it does not only aim to address the facilitation of recognition of academic credentials, and I repeat, academic credentials, and/or qualification, but broadens the scope to a process that refers to learning activities, whether formal, non-formal, or informal, covering the entire lifespan with the aim of improving and developing human capacities, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and competencies. Now, Article 1 in the Global Recognition Convention also speaks to qualifications acquired through recognized non-traditional learning modules that are subject to comparable quality assurance mechanisms and recommends to assess according to the rules and regulations of the constituent unit, using the same criteria as those applied to similar qualifications acquired by traditional learning modules. We believe that in today's environment, UNESCO's Global Recognition Convention is very timely, and we welcome the discussion. For WES staff and the individuals and organizations we serve, WES has strong commitment to support initiatives such as this, and we believe that it will help people that we serve utilize their education better. Julia?
Thank you, Becca. So I have one more question that I'd like to pose to you all. How do you see the Global Convention as a tool to support policies and practices concerning refugees and vulnerable students? Becca, would you like to add anything to this before we turn it on to the institutional ones?
Just quickly, Julia, I believe this gives, I mentioned this earlier, I believe the Global Recognition Convention will give more teeth, and it speaks specifically to this issue in Article 7 and speaks about the refugees and displaced persons. And it also gives the autonomy for regulatory provisions in various states, but it necessarily speaks and obliges us to have fair and efficient processes when it comes to refugees and displaced people. So I believe this will enable organizations such as WES and others and our colleagues that are on this webinar to assist people that find themselves in these situations. And as we look at the world, it might not be only wars on civil strife that will cause people to be in refugee-like situations. There are other various factors. For example, when we were looking at the Gateway program, we looked at other environmental factors that are causing people to be displaced as well. So I do believe this will provide a framework for all of us to work on that. Julia?
Chris, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, so in some ways, the Global Convention is most important to displaced persons. As we've talked about, this population frequently lacks documents detailing their academic background, so it has to be reconstructed or verified. I know that we at IU have worked a lot with AACRO's Article 26 backpack and the paper that was published, just talking about strategies to make sure that students are still meeting your institutional standards, but they may meet it in different ways. So reconstruction, different forms of verification, validation of those documents or that background. So yeah, I think the convention definitely provides that framework for how to approach this topic and how to make sure that we're allowing for these students, even though they come from a different background, different level of disparity, to still being able to enter the institutions, to study, to continue their education, and working with them to achieve that. Julia, back to you.
Okay, Suli, how about you? Do you have any points you'd like to make?
Well, I think Chris and Becca pretty much summed it up. It's a framework, as Becca mentioned, and that provides strategies that with which we can move forward. And in working with vulnerable students, I think that this is where it's a call for an action on our part. And personally, perhaps others share our challenge as well. And when required documents are not accessible, how do we as an institution move forward in these cases? And what processes need to be established in order to move forward? And how do we grant them that fair assessment when we do not have anything to go by? So I think these are really important questions as it relates to the Global Convention, and as we consider these cases, as we consider global recognition. There's just a lot of questions as far as in that aspect that for our institution personally, like I said, others may share the same challenges. What do we need to establish to be able to deliver that fair assessment that the Global Convention is calling for?
Thank you, Suli. So let's get back to the beginning of this. The Global Convention, we've outlined what it's about, what we've talked about at the symposium. But we know that the U.S. is not a member of UNESCO any longer and will not adopt or ratify this convention at any rate. But what is the current climate in the international climate for the U.S.? So let's think about what's being said and what's going on out there right now. Let me begin by saying that one of AACRO's signatures initiatives for the 2019-20 year is global recognition. This involves an effort to examine more closely the question of whether global recognition in international credential evaluation is necessary, desirable, or even possible. The conversation that surrounds recognition relative to higher education has been going on for decades in the United States. The same conversation regarding recognition going on globally has evolved in recent years, as we said, due to that increased student mobility. To that point, globally, the number of students studying abroad is expected to double by 2025. Thus, the notion of a global convention on the recognition of education qualifications has become more pressing. And with this, let's just look at a few graphs that I'm sure many of you have seen. This is one that we come from IIE's Project Atlas, and it really shows that in 2001, we had 2.1 million students, international students studying abroad, and the U.S. had 28% of them. In 2017, that number is 24%. But what's really interesting, I think, in this graph and worth noting is the fact that there are players that are significant players in drawing international students that weren't even in the picture in 2001. Those include Canada, Russia, and China. Next, here is a graph that simply shows the number of international students in the United States. There are over 1 million international students in the United States. The economic impact of those students is $42 billion. There is a significant economic factor for these students as well, for international scholars. Next is this slide, and this is where the concern starts to emerge. You'll see that it's the decline in new international student enrollment, which is presenting a challenge to the U.S. So that red box there actually shows in the dark blue that actually the new enrollment is what is declining. This has caused a lot of concern and a lot of notice by the U.S. And then finally, this slide is interesting, and this is something that Education USA has talked a bit about, in that saying that even though the U.S. is the top destination, we still have a very significant capacity to host international students that's not being fulfilled. Right now, 70% of the students that are studying in the United States study at a total of 200 institutions. 1 out of every 3 students is in either Texas, California, or New York, and we saw that a bit from what Suli showed us in her slides. Look at that compared to Australia, 142 institutions that are hosting the number of students that they host. It's really quite amazing. So much more capacity in the U.S. So going back and understanding that one of the objectives of the convention is to respect, uphold, and protect autonomy and the diversity of higher education institutions and systems is part of that convention. We need to think about, from the United States perspective, what can we do? What can we add here to this discussion? Is there a place for us to start thinking about whether or not we want to have a unified and clear statement of what our beliefs are on, is quality assurance important, transparency, fair and accurate representation, and assessment. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take the time now to look at the questions tab on the webinar dashboard, and feel free to type in your questions, which the panel and myself will then discuss. And if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share in that question, that would be great as well. While you're doing that, I just want to talk a little bit about the slides you just saw and where the U.S. is on our international student commitment, and talk about what's next. From AACRO's perspective, we would like you to get involved, and we'd like you to help us continue this conversation. We'd like you to think about the Global Convention and what it means for your work, the work you do every day. Although the U.S. won't sign onto the Global Convention, it doesn't necessarily mean that in our international admissions and credential evaluation community, we aren't adhering to those standards already and adhering to those principles that are outlined in the Global Convention. What about the possibility of creating something uniquely U.S.? This is something AACRO brought up at the symposium, and this is where we want to continue this conversation and discussion. We hope that you will consider joining us in engagement with colleagues, with international students, and all those in higher education as we continue to move forward with the best practices and standards of global recognition.
Thanks, Julie. And just for the panelists' information, you don't have keyboard and mouse control now. Julia, did you see the question I just sent through?
No, I did not. I'm sorry.
No problem. The question is specifically for Becca, and Alexander asked, for applicants who don't have or have little official credential documentation, what methods do you use to determine that they have completed their program?
Can you repeat the question, Michael? It was a little bit of a breakup.
No problem. For applicants who don't have or have little official credential documentation, what methods do you use to determine that they have completed their program?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The Gateway program and the pilot that we ran in 2017, what we needed at least one credible evidence of completion of a program. It could have been a photocopy of a degree certificate, if that's the only thing the applicant had, for example, or even a student ID, that's the only thing that applicant had. What we were able to do, we were able to do the reconstruction of the study of the applicant, what the applicant would have studied, and we were able to provide a course by course. Of course, we would not be able to provide the grades, but because of the resources that we have at West and because of 45 years of experience at the database, we were able to look at the curriculum that the engineering student would have completed. So we provided the list of courses that the person would have completed with the credits. Of course, there wouldn't be grades provided. And then what we provided is also next steps. So the admissions officer or a licensing body or an employer could do additional steps in order to perhaps test the applicant to be eligible to enter the program at the academic institution, or be eligible to enter the licensing process, or similar with the employment. So what we did is we started facilitating this process with the academic institutions and regulatory bodies in Canada, and we received a very positive response from the end users. They started using our reports. They did their additional steps that would be required in their own institutions, and gave a chance to the applicant. Now, understandably here, there's a factor of risk, right? So when we're talking about the academic institution, risk is different. When we're talking about the employment, risk is different, as well as when we're talking about the regulatory bodies. So the important part here, when we embarked on this program, was to speak about this amongst our partners, academic institutions and regulatory bodies, that we needed to share a risk here. Otherwise, applicants would have been excluded from the process right away because they had no documentation. So that was our method and approach.
Thank you. And then Leslie, I don't know if you got the question I just forwarded to you, just to see if that works.
Thanks,
If
Mike.
not,
Yep, I'm looking at it right now. I would like, is it the one about Italy?
Yes, yeah.
I'm having a hard time seeing it. Do you think you could read it to me?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So Simone, and pardon if I'm mispronouncing that, I would like to explore further the portability of recognition angle under the GRC. For example, could or should an evaluation report produced by WES be accepted by a university in Italy?
That's an interesting question. Go ahead, Leslie.
Well, thanks. I'll answer from my perspective, and then you can chime in, Becca. From AACRO's perspective, when we were doing credential evaluations for the public, we always felt like it was the receiving country's responsibility to interpret credentials from other countries into their own system. So from our AACRO perspective, no, we would say that it's not a good practice for one country to accept another country's evaluation report. It doesn't make sense. It's the receiving country that best understands their own system and makes placement recommendations that make the best sense for students coming in to be successful.
I would chime in. When it comes to Italy, for example, Europe there's a European qualifications passport which is a very, very robust and helpful process that European enigmatics have developed. Italy is part of it specifically. Now, let me speak a little bit about the portability. From a Canadian perspective, this is interesting. In Canada, because of the way Canada is based on provinces, evaluation reports didn't have the portability that it has now. So provinces would be designated to do their own assessments. It changed quite a while ago, maybe about 12 years ago, where the portability and where it started, and I'll give you a little bit more insight into this, where it started was if an assessment body in Vancouver would do a document authentication and an evaluation, that document does not need to be authenticated anymore, perhaps. So that did help in terms of sharing the assessments, as well as help the individual so they didn't have to go through the same process every time when they moved from one regulatory body to another. So there is that part, there is that experience in Canada that did help an individual.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bethel. Do we have any other questions, Mike?
No, I was going to say right now we don't have any others. If you want to, we can give it a minute or two, but we are about 4 minutes shy of our official end time. So if you do want to wrap it up early, you can go ahead and start that process, and I'll jump in if a question pops up.
Okay, so let's go on to the next slide, Mike.
Sure.
So we've added some resources and additional reading if you'd like to know any more about the Global Convention. Once again, there's AACRO's Signature Initiative page. We really do encourage you to go on there and click on the Receive Updates, and you will be part of this conversation right along with us. There are also speaker bios, and there are a couple of pictures on those speaker bios of the actual meeting, UNESCO meeting, where we were drafting the convention, and you can see all the little desks there with the country names on them. So that was quite an honor for AACRO to be an observer there. And then finally, we have a final page of some other upcoming trainings that AACRO is doing. Webinars, we have a webinar on the PESC geocode. We have one coming up, that's next week, October 8th. The following week, we have Hungarian Higher Education in Crisis and Institutional Ethnography of Hungarian Higher Education. And also we have our Strategic Enrollment Management Conference, which will be held in about a month from today in Dallas, Texas. Please check our website for any other activities and going-ons. And members, we encourage you to read through Connect and our international newsletter for updates on the Global Convention and what's going on, and check back to our website often. I would like to take a minute to just thank our panelists, Becca, Chris, and Suli, for being willing to, after the symposium that they attended, to come in and talk about that symposium and where we are going next. We really appreciate their time and their insights, and we invite more of you members to get involved and keep the conversation going. Any other questions, Mike?
No further questions. I just wanted to add a note that everyone who's attended this webinar will receive a follow-up email in about an hour that includes a post-webinar survey. We would love for you to fill that out. We'll also include within that email a link to download this slide deck from today, so you can reference it at another point. And this webinar has been recorded, so if you need to reference it at a later point, or if you want to send it to a colleague, then you can just check the website page there as well. Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody,
for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It was a pleasure.